Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is the podcast where we podcast. I am your host, podcaster.
We're
This
gonna
is my
edit
co-host,
in and
podcast too.
are we gonna edit in the name eventually or no?
Yeah, I mean, we can kind of keep it fast and loose, we'll work on developing the name of the podcast as we go. I think
Yeah.
trying to find something that's more because I want this to be kind of like an accessible version of philosophy, one that's more like integratable into your everyday life. One that's like just a couple guys who are trying to bring in things they know in and have good discussions, then kind of solidifying ideas together and trying to build on pre-existing conversations we've had in some way that's like easy to follow and easy to like catch up on too. So some title that works that in is probably what we'll go with. Maybe they should make that our entire title. It'll be like
two guys talking about
yeah.
philosophize this. That's one that already exists. That's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not super approachable though. Anyway.
Cool. So today's topic is motivation. I think we're gonna just try to start to crack the egg. This might spin off into other conversations, but you have some notes here, so I'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, I'll talk about the one that actually I don't know that I consider this my primary motivation, but I think it's the one that is the most easy to map onto, I think, people that you don't know or just people in general, which is like the biological motivation. I mean, I see it in the sense of like, preserving your genes, right? That's like the motivation of, that's not even for people, that's just like for species, right? Like I always remember this scene from Minority Report where he ends up in like the creepy plant lady's greenhouse, and she has like a plant there and she just starts squeezing it, like killing it, and then the plant just like cuts her. And she's like, this is the common denominator, right? Things seek to preserve themselves like individually, and then they seek to preserve their offspring or whatever equivalent as like the next proxy. Or even better example, you have no children, but you seek to preserve your family, your cousins, your aunts and uncles, whatever they are, because they are some mapping of your genes, right?
I do like the word preserve here. It has a little bit of a implication where you're acting proactively, right? Like preservation requires being proactive. It's not just a reactive thing.
Yeah, it's like grasshopper and ant, right? Like you preserve your genes by like working through the summer so that in the winter you have food to eat. It's not like, oh, in the winter, what do I do now that to preserve my genes? It's not reactive, or shouldn't be, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's like, I wonder if that's kind of like a pretty hefty implication to even imply, like, because it implies that because not all life has the ability to act at a cognitive order that's high enough to think that far ahead, right? They are almost always like, some things are just definitely only acting reactively.
For sure. You would argue that basically everything that doesn't have like an advanced prefrontal cortex, right? Or maybe not even that part of your brain, but just some part of your brain that allows you to do some sort of planning that's not reactive.
Right.
But I don't know. I've also heard arguments that like it's easy to view individuals as stupid and then not actually ascribe intelligence to a collective, where the collective might be smarter. I think we talked maybe about it 2 times ago, like ants and bees. Like the collective of a beehive is extremely intelligent, right? In terms of being able to get resources and move around and produce more species. But an individual drone is not very intelligent, or relatively speaking, wouldn't be considered that intelligent.
Is distributive.
Yeah.
It's like the Kubernetes of...
Exactly, yeah. They literally are a cluster, right? I mean, that's probably the term.
And kill one and the just spins right back up.
Yep, they got another one in the oven.
I think that there's a little bit... I think actually I think that this idea is being somewhat drowned by the millstones around its own neck, right? Because I think that since it implies that things are acting proactively, how do you get to the point of acting in the in the mission of preserving your genes, if you have to get there by proxy of evolution, where you're definitely at some point were evolved from something that could only purely act reactively. Like at what point it's like, at what point does it cross over from the motivation being to react to danger or react to stimulus to acting proactively to preserve your genes? Because I think for me, I guess I'll give you a chance to respond in a second, but for me, it's like this is the result of a thriving species. Like it's a byproduct of a thriving species that the genes are preserved or carried on, or like it is a necessary trait of a surviving species or surviving life form, right? Just because something has the property of preserving itself doesn't mean that that's the motivation. It's like you can't get an is from an id. It's like you can't get an is from an ought, or an ought from an is. I think that's what I think that this comes down to.
That's possible. I also think too that maybe this, like a great example of how I think of this playing out just in my own life, is like the amount of love that you feel for like a child, like your child, or even like a nephew or something like that. You wouldn't say like, oh, that's to preserve your genes as a person, because that's not what you're like. You build a strong relationship with them through experience, and I think that's what motivates you to preserve them. It's not like, oh, this thing contains 20 something of my chromosomes, or 5 or whatever section. I don't think any creature thinks of it that way, but I would argue that that's like the like underlying motivation is to preserve your genes, but then the things that you actually perceive as the motivation are much more complicated, like a strong bond or some sort of behavioral like reflex, like, oh, your child steps into traffic and you just go and grab them and pull them back. Like your motivation wasn't like, oh, my genes. It was like, I need to save this thing. So, that might be to your point. It might not be the motivation at all. It's just the reason why some of these behaviors exist, I think, is to preserve gene, because it's easy to think of the converse. I guess, or I'm probably going to get whichever one it is, but let's say you're an organism that doesn't seek to preserve its genes. Like, how many generations do you exist? You probably don't exist very long, because you engage in a lot of behaviors that are self-destructive. I mean, you can see this in people, right? Like it's easy to view it with the genders, because 80% of women, I think, become mothers. That's like a number I've heard. It might be lower, it might be higher, but a much lower percentage of men become fathers. And it's pretty easy to see the men that don't become fathers. They're usually the more outcast, self-destructive behavior kind of men, the one that no woman in their right mind would, want to bear children with. Those, they kind of like line up with they don't seek to preserve their genes, their personal genes. So why would anyone want to integrate with them and create a being and try and preserve? It's an act that's like dangerous for the woman, right? Putting themselves in. Yeah.
I actually thought of an interesting suggestion. I was trying to figure out the right way to word this, but kind of coming from what you're saying, I'm interested in hearing what you think, is that it kind of dawned on me that maybe you can be motivated to do something, but because we have a higher order, we're capable of higher order thinking, that we're able to ignore things that our subconscious motivations are pushing us towards. Like, you could be motivated to have children, but that you would choose to, you can use your higher order thinking to choose to ignore something that biologically you're being told to do.
Yeah. And I think with women, especially since like birth control, like modern birth control has existed, they're a great example of that, right? Like, there's a biological motivation for them to have children. They have a very short window in which their bodies could really handle it. But it really drastically affects their lives and their career if they're in their 20s and they're like, I'm gonna have a kid. It's just puts them. So they do all sorts of things. They don't just take birth control. They use any form of protective sex, or IUDs, the intrauterine devices. There's all sorts of ways that women are basically going against their biological desire to have children because they want to have their own independent lives.
So if you're able to consciously ignore like your subconscious motivations, then like in the examples you're talking about, then what is motivating the conscious mind? I guess is because I have this kind of theory that like, motivation is below conscious thought. That's at least something that I believe. But
that's possible.
But I guess even if that's true, then there is that implies there's this like separate being that exists consciously that also has motivations separate from the subconscious ones. Because like that must mean there's like two layers of motivation, I guess, at least.
Yeah, this is where I could bring up the concept that I think codifies this pretty well, that like id, ego, superego concept from Freud. And some people are very anti-Freud. I actually don't find that much wrong with him. I just think he was a little sex crazed, so a lot of what believes his philosophy.
Yeah, people don't realize that there's a lot of modern day psychology is based off of Freud's work. It's just that they worked on it more, they developed it more.
Yeah, and I really like my brother's speech therapist said she was a huge fan of Freud, and when she was learning him, and she said that the sex parts are probably him pushing it to the extreme, but I think attention is probably the more important thing. And that is something I do kind of agree with, like the things where it's like you're like for women, the Oedipal complex where, kids and their mother, like boys and their mothers, there being some element of attraction, and then like female, like daughters and their fathers. I don't think there's like a sexual attraction. I think that's kind of a bizarre concept, but the idea of like wanting their attention and wanting their praise, recognition, I mean, that's where the term like daddy issues come up, or, someone who's a mama's boy or not a mama's boy, right? I think those are that's all from those concepts that Freud brought up. I mean, not necessarily related to ego, superego, but just to point out that there's validity in those thoughts, even if they are not necessarily.
Yeah, the id, ego, and superego. I guess if we talk about that a little bit more for people that are not familiar with it, isn't it that like the id is like motivated by, like they actually are all differentiated by their motivations, I think, right? Because like the id is motivated by base needs like sex, food, and just in general like those sorts of pleasures or satisfactions. But the I don't quite remember the super ego and the ego.
I want to make sure I don't confuse them, because one of them is basically society and one of them is like your consciousness mediating the two. Okay. I want to make sure that I get the ones right. So the ego is part of the conscious personality. It's when the person is aware of what they think about themselves. So that's your ego. So the best example is like the id is your devil and the superego is the angel on your shoulder.
Yeah.
But I think the superego more represents, I always thought of it as representing like society or religion, like things that are imposed on all people kind of uniformly.
Interesting. So the ego is not, okay, so the id has a lot of motivations or drives that it oppresses on a person's ego, who the ego's job is to sort out those sort of like, devil on their shoulders sort of thing.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the interesting thing about the split is I would never argue that one is more important than the other. Like they all have a part to play. Like, I guess my point with the id, like, let's say you are a person that has almost no id. So you have no desire to work for yourself or preserve yourself. So you're always putting yourself last. You're always letting other people pile on to you. Eventually you just kind of fall apart because you've been weighed down and you haven't given yourself time and, relaxation, whatever it is. You haven't fed that part of you, and that part of you is important. I mean, you don't survive without it, I don't think. It's the animal part, right?
Yeah, I think the better developed version of this idea is the shadow from Jung, because I think that's
makes sense. Yeah,
the shadow is because I think that it is kind of like an oversimplification when it talks about like basically the drive to do bad things or things you should not do, or I think that actually I think the way I'm voicing it's more like what the shadow is, which is the shadow is kind of like everything that you don't want yourself to be but you are. That's, I think, the shadow in terms of the in terms of Jung, that there's like this idea that there are motivations or ways that you think or parts of you that you suppress because you don't want to show them to others, or you can't face them yourself. Like you can't admit that you're that type of person. Like it'd be the idea of like an alcoholic not believing they have a drinking problem, because like the part,
Right.
like, you know, it's like the idea that, well, yeah, there's a part of me that likes to drink, but I'm just not going to think about that. I'm just not going to think about why I like to drink, because that's like my shadow. That's different than me. You know, it's separate from me, and I'm going to suppress that. And there's a decent amount of Jung that goes into integrating your shadow. And so that's why I don't necessarily like the id ego super ego, because it doesn't ever provide you with the final equation,
Integration,
here, you know,
or
the integration of all the three personalities. It's just like, oh well, these three things are at odds at all times, and it further, I think, you know, solidifies that the id is different than you. No, I mean, it's like another thing that you could think with shadow is like some of the stuff Allison's gotten into with like the mind body psychology stuff, where it's like you can end up causing yourself chronic pain because like the suppressed stress and everything comes out as pain. And some people's stories are like, you know, a mother who is resentful towards her kids, but she would never say that she resents her kids, right? Because because she feels like she's a good mother, or like she wanted to have a perfect family. And so the idea that she resented her kids would just go against this idea of like having or wanting a perfect family, which is actually like when she incorporated the shadow and talked about it more, it was more like, well, I do resent my kids, but I resent my kids because I wanted the perfect family. And because I didn't have that growing up, and I wanted to that's all I wanted, was to make a perfect family. And my kids are not like giving me this perfect life. So I'm resentful that this isn't as idyllic as I wanted it to be. And that's, I think, like the really interesting thing in my mind is that like they do come from you. They're ideas that once you unpack them, then they'll make more sense. But you have to kind of work through your shame and guilt around that part of you in order to get there.
Yeah, I like the shadow as the way I've kind of interpreted it is, I think, like you talked about, like not saying you have a drinking problem, like Alcoholics Anonymous as a good example of it integrating the shadow, is saying like, I am an alcoholic, right? And it's a disease that I have, and I have to give myself up to. That's, I think, the superego part, is you say you give yourself up to a higher power. You're trying to you basically relinquish some. This is, I think, the most positive aspect of religion in my mind. Like you relinquish the fact that you can't control it, and so you ask something more powerful than you to lend you strength to deal with it. And I mean, that's like you said, I don't think there's like the id where I also think of the id, like the greatest example of the id is just the 2-year-old. Like if you imagine what a 2-year-old would do.
Yep. Yeah.
Then you've got the id nailed down, right? They grab everything they want, they throw everything. They don't have they don't have an understanding of all these concepts that are layered on culturally and societally, right? They would run around naked. They would do whatever, regardless of other people's beliefs.
It's funny that you say that, because the whole thing I was talking about, a lot of the mind body psychology, one of the things they talk about doing is, I think, inner child work. Where it's basically that you put a microphone to you basically embrace your inner child and just speak as if you were a child. This has been something at work I've been trying to do recently. It's not been going very well. I was like been thinking of like doing a talk on it to kind of like maybe explain a little bit more. But I you know, had an issue with a coworker and was talking to somebody about it, and I was like, you know, my initial thought was that they're just being a baby about it. And like I was saying, like, the reason I say that is because, you know, I thought it, and so I should just put a voice to that and say it, and then move past it and be able, so I can get to the point where it's like, well, he's not. I got the impression that he's being a baby, but I know that's not the case. So what else is there? Like, and it lets me kind of get over the initial immature reaction. Like the point is not that I like believe that thing. I don't like fully embrace like the inner child and just be like, oh yeah, you know, that's the right interpretation here. But I think if I was to just say like, oh, he's being a baby, and then just like the next thing I think is like, I can't think that, you know, that's not right to think that about somebody, and then just like move on. Like I don't ever get to what actually is going wrong here, right? Because I just said, oh, well, you know, it's not fair to him to say that, so I should just move on, right? If you just say that, then it's like, well, okay, but there probably was something to be improved on there. There probably was something going wrong there that I could have gotten to had I just like not been, you know, really judgmental towards myself about my initial reaction to it.
Right.
And instead just like allowed myself to be a little immature in spirit of being on the path to being more mature and finding the right answers to work better with them, like, and to be a better, to like, you know, have a better working relationship with them and a better understanding of them and myself, you know.
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, it's always hard to understand if there is something to improve or if it's just to, you know,
I mean,
two people disagreeing. Then
I guess my point with that was like the child voice, like I have an inner child, like what do I do? Just lock it in a cage and just don't ever let it speak. And then it just kind of festers, and then I start like, you know, actually
comes out in other ways.
Stuff. Yeah, it comes out in other ways. And you try to put a lid on it and everything.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to go down those kind of rabbit holes because it really like kind of comes back to the motivation discussion, like these really complex thoughts and ideas that I have, like, why do I even bother thinking about this stuff? Like, this is definitely not preserving my genes. Becoming a better coworker, I don't know if I could ever reduce that to a biological essentialism.
Yeah, I always draw the line. This is where I have a societal based motivation thing on here, but I draw the line like society is built on preserving some sort of biology, right? Like this tribe, this group, this country, you preserve that. And like by being a better coworker, you're ensuring that your place in the system is more guaranteed, right? You're going to make more money. You're not going to get fired, that sort of stuff. But
yeah, I agree. I totally agree.
A lot of bridges away from preserving your genes. It's not very close.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it was kind of back to what I was saying earlier, where it's like any society that is thriving has the trait of preserving their genes.
Exactly. I mean, that's basically what thrive means, right?
Yeah, yeah. But it's not a motivation, right? It's different for the individual entities to be motivated by it versus the collective has that property. I think that was like what I was saying. Like, I don't think you can make that conclusion.
The arrow of causality is probably not the right way. It's not like, because you want to preserve your genes, you want to be a better coworker. It's like, by being a better coworker, you will preserve your genes.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so you could be motivated. The motivation could be actually that like collectivism is actually the motivation. And it's that, you know, well, I think it's just that there's a lot of benefits to behaving in a collectivist way, just as using this as an example, that like are beyond just preserving your genes. And so while that does produce a trait, you know, another thing is like preserving your genes is a pretty broad term. Like preserving it from what? Like preserving
annihilation,
it from,
right?
Well, I mean, preserving it from like attacks within a tribe or attacks from other species attacking your own or other entities or disease
broad.
or it's like it's very broad.
And like you said, I think one of the last thing you listed is like how does being a better coworker protect you from like a disease like COVID or something? That doesn't necessarily. Maybe there's some tenuous thing like, you help someone out who was sick, then you could say, well, there you go, you help preserve that person's genes. Yeah. I think the preserving the genes one is a very interesting one. If you say like, well, what if this person had no family and was infertile? Then what the hell is, what are they doing? But then I also point out, I'm like, well, your is relative. It can be like your species' genes or another species' genes.
Yeah, I guess the example you gave about the bee is like they're not preserving their own individual DNA. They're preserving their group or their hive or whatever you call it, or a group of bees is called.
Yep, hive. Yep, that's right. The cluster, like Kubernetes. No. Yeah. No, maybe we should. The work one might be a good segue to talk about like society-based motivations, and that kind of goes into the superego.
Yep.
Like, why do people like? That's like a good one. Like, why is Donald Trump running again in 2024, right? Or anyone, right? Why is Biden going to run again? Or why did all these people run for the midterms? Like, what? I just wrote in my notes, power, exclamation points, which I find is a fun one, especially if you're a Marxist or anti-Marxist.
Yeah, power is a motivation. That's pretty pervasive in the common dialogue today, that like everything's comes down to power.
Yeah. the truth to
I don't think that's
power, might is
true.
right.
I mean, I think that, I mean, even like Nietzsche, the way he kind of like applies it to, it's like, oh, well, even like the religious person who gives up all of their possessions and makes themselves poor and, you know, starves themselves to death, ultimately is just trying to get power over other people, because, you know, they're just trying to get people to change and do what they want to do, or doing what they're doing, or whatever, believe what they believe.
Wins their minds and hearts,
exactly,
right? Hearts,
yeah.
minds, yeah.
So that's an interesting idea.
Totally. I mean, it's
Yeah.
I think it was it was like it's probably quoted from elsewhere, but I heard it in X-Men. It was like the X-Men animated series from the 90s where
All of my quotes come from X-Men, yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, I don't know. I don't know anyone besides this one where it's Nightcrawler. His character's religious, and someone's asking him, like, why are you religious? Like, you can teleport. Like, why do you even need all this stuff? He's like, oh, you know, power can, you know, move an army or move a river or whatever. But he's like, but faith can move mountains. That was his, like, and I do pretty strongly, when we talk about power, I mean, the greatest power that any human has is the power to make another human do something, because we didn't get to this for Unpreserving Your Genes, but I was reading one of the like biology books, Dawkins or someone like that, where he said like the greatest evolutionary behavior ever conceived is not being the fastest or being the strongest. It's cooperation, by and large. Like the most cooperative creatures are the ones that have taken over this planet.
Yeah.
So
no, totally.
There's your power.
Gosh, I think I'm trying to figure out what wrongs my like what it seems so wrong. Like, doesn't pass the smell test when someone says everything's about power. Maybe it's just that like the weird side of me that's like, yeah, but no matter how much power you have, like, and no matter how much pain you inflict on me, and how much you torture my mind with your confusing questions, like, you don't get my soul, though. I guess that's the kind of thing too with like power wise. Like, I still am going to exist, and I think that people kind of get that intuitively. Like they have their own consciousness that's beyond the control of power. So given that like everybody has their own consciousness, and everybody that is conscious believes themselves to be conscious, I think like finds weird power is kind of a weird thing, where it's like, we all know that this game we're playing has like an end date, and that whatever's happening here probably won't continue, other than it'll continue to affect the people that are playing this game. What you do continues to affect that, but like your soul or your consciousness is not ultimately tied, I think, to the same game, unless you could believe in reincarnation. But I think that you know, you could also not believe in reincarnation. You could not believe in afterlife. You could believe in an afterlife. Like, there's like infinite explanations of what you think happen after you die, but nothing explains why we care about what happens after we die. I guess like that's the kind of thing where I'm trying to get out with motivation.
Preserve your genes. No.
why do I care? Like, why? Other than like that, you know, I think, therefore
you are
awesome. Or however that quote goes. That's Magneto,
Descartes.
1979.
Descartes, not Magneto.
I believe Magneto said that.
Cogito ergo sum. Yeah. Magneto said, kill all the non-mutant people because they tortured me in concentration camps or whatever. Anyway.
Yeah. Something to consider. Or you can respond to what I said. Yeah.
No, I think the like desire to thank you. The desire to like exist beyond your own lifetime is, I feel like it's a feature of how our brains are, like that we're so future focused, and we don't see the present as nearly as, or I don't know if this is true for everyone, but at least for me, you know, you kind of see like everything you do is paving some path into the future. You're not like, most of the things you do aren't like, oh, I'm doing this because in the moment I love doing it. If you're very id focused, then yeah, that's, you know, doing, and not all id things are bad. Obviously some of them are like restoring, but I think having that focus on the future is super motivating to people's minds, as far as like, oh, I really want to continue to live, into a next life, if there is one, or if I'm reincarnated, or if it's just one afterlife that I go to. I want to have the best experience there. I'm a very future focused person in the current existence. So why wouldn't I try and carry that forward into the next one? Then
I've definitely met people that believe that, and I definitely met people that are like really afraid of death and don't want life to end, and like really fight tooth and nail to not die, and like sleep upside down with buckets of ice on their head to like live longer. And I guess in that sense, it's like totally, you could maybe totally make the argument that they're purely motivated by that biological essentialism thing of like, I want to live.
I think so.
I want to preserve my life. But is that like, then you kind of, this thing kind of contradicts the power thing. Like you have people that you meet that kind of present as like biologically essentially having the biological essentialism motivation. People that present as that are a counterpoint, I think, to the will to power being the prime driver, prime mover.
Yeah, I do. I think people come in all shapes and sizes too. So I don't see the people that are very biological essentialists, I want to live forever people, as the same. Maybe they are, but I don't see them as the same people that are like, oh yeah, power means being able to tell other people what to do and they'll do it without any barriers. It's interesting reading. I just have like an espresso what is it, subscription, so it's like The Economist, like short articles, and I always get depressed about the American ones. I'm like, oh no, we're doing whatever. But then I read about these other countries and it's like, oh yeah, the newly elected president of Brazil, he was like Brazil's president before and he went to jail. Like this is a guy that's been around the block. And was he in jail for good reason? Who knows? I mean, it just shows kind of the way the system isn't great. And these people, I'm assuming, right, these people that occupy all sorts of positions of power, they probably want to live as long as they can or have thoughts about that, but I don't think it's like about the best form of their bodies, right? I think they just view society as something that they get to shape to their will.
Yeah.
And what motivations they have, I don't know. I think it's more than just preserving your genes. It's probably a lot more complicated than that.
I think the reduction of the biological essentialism motivation is more succinctly summarized as fear motivation, but being motivated by fear.
Definitely.
And I think that also, if you kind of consider that fear is a motivator, fear can be a motivation, then like that's also another counterpoint to will to power, because it's like, well, yeah, everybody's will to acquire power is their motivator, the prime driver, prime mover. But then like, what about people that are just afraid and just like, they are agoraphobics that never want to leave their home? I don't think they're trying to acquire power or attain power. I think they're just trying to attain not being subjected to the things they're afraid of.
Right. And I would argue those people, their ids have taken control of them in like a non-intuitive way. If going to the right, like if you're agoraphobic or if you're just afraid and fear is your motivator, I mean, fear is an id. That's like one of the core parts of your id, right? Like if you bring up the 2-year-old again, 2-year-olds are afraid at like I would turn, like I have, she's not 2, but she's almost 2. A little one running around. Like if I turn like something on that's really loud, she runs away. Like has never seen it before, right? I mean, that's such a basic motivator from the biological perspective of like the things that you don't know can be the things that kill you. Like they're scary, they're loud, the things we've been trained to be afraid of, things that have lots of legs or slither or whatever it is. Those are scary.
Yeah, this kind of comes into like loss aversion sort of territory too. I think we're like, if we were kind of say fear's the primary motivator, prime motivation, prime driver, then like I think you're kind of playing into some of the things on loss aversion, why people they're afraid to lose things more than they are, motivated to gain stuff. They'd more sooner avoid a situation that would result in them losing. Yeah, this is exactly how people play Smash Brothers. They don't want to engage. They run away. They zone the entire time because they're afraid of losing. They don't take action.
Yeah, it's how people also spend their money and things like that. They're very conservative with losses and very much try and but more conservative against losing money than they are when it comes to like gaining money. If it's weighed against a bigger loss, then they'll just won't move, or like you said, they just zone, which in the financial world, I guess, just means leaving your money in the bank.
Yeah, it's like avoidance. It's total avoidance, like avoiding interacting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, like, I'm trying to think right now, like, fear is a good counterpoint to will to power, but I wonder if that the reverse is true too. Like the examples of people that take big risks and that are actually trying to acquire power. If that's a counterpoint to them, are they motivated? Could you explain that by fear motivation? Because I don't think you can explain a fear motivated person as being motivated by power, but I think that you could describe, I don't know, I think you could describe someone that is acquiring power as a fear motivated person, because you could say they're afraid of not being in power. They're afraid of somebody else having more power than them.
Yeah, like someone the greatest
being able to oppress them.
Right. I feel like the greatest fear of anyone who you'd label as a megalomaniac is just never being spoken about. Like if, Donald Trump's an easy target because in many ways, he's also a lot smarter than people give him credit for. Like I think primarily he won the election because he just dominated the news coverage for the entire primaries and the run up to the election in 2016. So everyone was shocked, but I'm like, this is the only man you've even been talking about. Like no one even, like they said Hillary once for every 300 times they said Trump's name. Like the best thing he could have done is not said his name at all. Like that's, that's what he wanted, or that's what he would have not wanted. That would have been his greatest fear. That's not being spoken about. So, and I think it goes for all megalomaniacs or narcissists. They want to hear their own name.
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking up the definition of fear right now, or is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone or something is dangerous, likely to cause pain or a threat.
Yeah.
So I guess like avoiding danger. Because I guess even like if you're talking about someone they could be afraid that someone will oppress them. But I guess no. Okay, here's the thing. I think you could take somebody that. Okay, also let's put aside that. How do we factor in extreme neurodivergent people who are like, I want to inflict pain on other people. That gives me joy.
Like sociopaths or psychopaths.
Yeah, sociopaths or psychopaths. Like, how do they is our model burden to explain that as well?
I have interesting thoughts on those.
I would say yes. I would probably just say yes, because like while I feel like they might be missing some things in their they might be missing some things. I'm not going to say like in their brain or whatever, but they might be missing things like empathy, and that's normally present in a person. I think that empathy might push back against this motivation to do harm. Like, you know, and I think exactly, but it doesn't mean that there's no motivation there. And I think that doesn't mean that things that motivate psychopaths or sociopaths don't exist in everyday people that are just more mean or rude or are cruel than other people but aren't doesn't reach to the point of being a psychopath.
I do think we paint them very negatively, sociopaths and psychopaths, which would make sense because they kind of go against a lot of precepts of society. Like you could basically lay out the 10 commandments and you probably say, well, anyone that's sociopathic or psychopathic probably doesn't care, like, you know, or any sort of commandment. They don't care about those sorts of things because, well, I don't know, there's more than one reason, but I think people have said like you do brain scans of these people and they don't, like you said, they don't light up empathically. They don't have those pieces that, you know, when it says thou shalt not kill, it's supposed to be like, oh, because you're supposed to care about other people, and killing them, you understand, represents an end of some sort, either an ultimate one or at least for this life.
Yeah, but doesn't that push back against the motivation that's like, I guess in the case of empathy being present, it's not that empathy is a I guess it is a motivation, but it's like it's not the thing that's making them want to murder people.
It's a break.
It's a motivation that probably exists in more people than those people that lack empathy. It's just that people that have empathy don't act on those impulses, or those impulses come out in ways that they're able to, you know, like maybe they aren't motivated to kill people because the empathy counteracts it, but then the part that they are, motivated to do is maybe hunt or something like that.
Yeah, but hunting is very different than, I mean, it's killing, but the people I've talked to that are all hunters, it's either for sport, which then it's, I mean, you could consider it some sort of like maybe labeling it a sociopathy or whatever, but I don't think it's, I think it's, exercising a drive that's in all primates really, which all primates basically kill for food. I mean, there's no primates I know of that are vegetarian only, except like gorillas or a few other ones, but they've kind of diverged pretty strongly from like chimps and bonobos, which I'm pretty sure or go around killing monkeys and other things to eat. So that's part of their hunting drive. And the food thing, I mean, that's the other reason. Most people I know that hunt, they eat the things that they kill. They don't just do it for sport.
Well, I will say we can use myself as a case study here. There is a part of me that wants to become super athletic and just go out and hunt with a knife, just to just grab the world by my hands and just wrestle it down.
Bear Grylls or something like that.
Some bear or something and just take it down with my hands. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know where that motivation's coming from. I don't revel in the pain of another creature. It's more what I would say is like, it's testosterone, but but it's like hormones. More competition. It's more competition than it is, I would say. I guess what you could say is sport. They hunt for sport, but I guess in the case of sport, the hunters are competing against each other, or because they're like, oh, I shot a bigger deer than you did. But like for me, I guess you could compete with the other person, but for me, it would be more like competing against nature.
Yeah, they're two sports. It's a sport against like I got the biggest fish, or I fought the fish and I won. Right?
Yeah, like the Moby Dick thing.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
I would be the Moby Dick hunter. That's just doing it to fight my enemy, my arch nemesis.
Yeah, the white whale. Yeah, I think there's a lot of. I also see that as kind of preserving. I mean, maybe it's a little off bit farther from preserving your genes. It's like there's a motivation to be more powerful than something.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. It's kind of the will to power. You could say that.
Yeah.
I want to be powerful. I want to prove that I'm powerful. But, I guess that's what it is. It's less about having the power to do it and more about proving that I have the power to do it. But that's what I think is interesting, because it's like, I don't know that if it's because, I will go to somebody and because I'm holding the head of a lion or whatever, they're now going to give me a job promotion, or they're going to stop being mean to me.
Can you imagine you walk into work and you just lay down like a bear carcass on on your desk?
And I was like, I didn't see that.
I think I deserve that promotion today.
Yeah. And then the HR comes up and you're like, and I'm just have to be like, I didn't see anything in the employee's handbook that said
I couldn't drag a bear carcass in it.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the fine print here. I'm not reading between the lines here.
It probably violates some Virginia workplace law thing about health and safety.
Yeah.
Maybe if it were stuffed or properly taxidermied or something, it would be fine. Or not fine, but more bizarre than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's even proving to I don't know if it's proving to myself it's probably proving to myself that I could do it. I don't even think that's it, dude. I think it's like there's this, I'm an Aries, so I've just got this like crazy, like, I would say like the god of war lives in me, because I think that's kind of what like
that's so
the Greeks would think, right? Like when they said like the god of war, it was the gods were kind of like your motivations. They were kind of like your underlying feelings and emotions and stuff. There was like a god that represented that, and that's where this comes from, this feeling of like, because I would feel like I would be thriving back in like ancient Greece and Sparta or whatever, like as a Spartan. I think that was that's where I would be doing the best. It's just like put me out there, just like throwing hands and catching spears and stuff. And I would just love to be in that environment. That's like not even like, I don't even understand what it is, that I just know that I would love to be in that environment. I don't quite, modern warfare is not appealing to me, so that's why I never went into the military. But like that sort of combat sort of stuff really, I mean, it's why I'm big into games. I think is from this exact feeling, is the feeling I get when I back throw someone off the stage and down air them with Captain Falcon.
Yeah, that's like it's a maybe not contest, but conquest or competition. Those are I guess this gets into, I think, one of the other best motivations that I can think of that doesn't necessarily have a biological piece, but it's what you're talking about, I think, is not a small piece. It's probably a big fraction of it, which is mastery. I think mastery is also like, to me, I believe it's the greatest like individual motivation you can have. Like understanding that you're a human who only lives, roughly 80 years, give or take. You could die a lot sooner, or you could live even a little longer, but 80 years is basically all you got. No human that's ever lived has really accomplished more than one or, 5 or 10 great things in those 80 years. And they do it in a very narrow channel, right? Like,
Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah, and but I mean, he's a good example. What do people remember him for? Like when you say Leonardo da Vinci, they think of him as
a painter, his engineering and his like biology, and didn't he do like he dissected like humans and stuff, didn't he?
Yeah, and so so he's like, what they call polymath or whatever it is. But I would also say that what he is the master of, I think, is visualizing concepts. So like I went to an exhibit of his and it was just all of these inventions, and like half of them didn't even necessarily work, but they were like inspirational, right? Like for like a helicopter, he like had wouldn't have worked in that way. But I think his mastery was like you talk about dissecting. I mean, he's able to describe something visually either with drawing or words or whatever it is, or both.
I mean, what I will share, what is perfectly in line with what you're saying, is that something I've learned in myself is that the more time you spend thinking about what you should be doing and not doing things, like the more you're just kind of spinning your wheels and digging yourself deeper into the mud. I think if like your
analysis paralysis.
Yeah, exactly. If you're thinking like, oh, well, I could become a software developer, or I could become a mechanical engineer, I'm just gonna and then you kind of ask yourself more questions about becoming more detailed about the thing you should be doing versus like somebody that just goes out and just writes a bunch of code. Like that person at the end of the day will have developed their skills more than you have, who has just sat around asking questions about what you should be doing. Like I think that's like part of us doing this podcast here is just being like, let's just be more action oriented. For me at least, it's like let's start figuring some stuff out and like actually putting it down on paper and or putting it in recording form, like a recorded hard form, having these discussions, because this is something that is an extension of what I do a lot in my own life, which is a lot of very neurotic thinking. But I think that it's for the benefit of like figuring stuff out. I think this is like a good outlet for this sort of energy that I have. Would normally focus on wondering what character I would play in Smash.
Useful maybe but I mean, Smash, like anything in my mind, these are all forms of mastery. Like for example, I consider myself like a perpetual video game amateur because I've never played any video game an amount of time and put in enough effort to become like an expert or a master of that game. But I enjoy them, so I'll play them. So it's amateur hour. But I don't think that's necessarily bad, but you're not remembered for those things. You don't really change the world with those things.
Fair. Yeah, I went to a friend's house the other day. He's like one of my friends from high school and college, and he's somebody that's like, he's very good at a lot of things. Like you could just go play pool with him and he'll just kick your butt in pool. He can juggle, like he's really good at golf and skating, and he's also an engineer and all this stuff. And so he's just like, I would say that he does a lot of things. Okay, so there's somebody that's like, they do one thing and they're very good at that one thing. And then there's people that do a lot of things. They're not really good at any of those things. And there's people like him who do a lot of things and they're also good at all those things.
Polymath is the term, right?
Yeah. And I think that he,
like Da Vinci,
kind of like what you're saying about being an amateur at all these games that you play. I kind of felt that way going and playing with him and playing pool and stuff, where it's like I played pool a lot growing up with my dad, but like I'm nowhere near as good at pool as he is. And like I could sit around and be like, oh well, he just sits around and plays pool all the time, which is kind of true. He plays a lot of pool. He plays in a pool league, but like he also does like a lot of other stuff too. So it's not like what I would say is that he knows when he likes something, like when he likes a hobby, he like immerses himself in it for a period of time. and
True
he will
mastery.
come back to those things and then continue. And when he comes back to those things, he just picks up and keeps refining his skill at those things. Not like what I do, where I come back to them and I'm like, all right, let's spend 3 days thinking about how I'm going to approach this, and then ultimately do nothing and go back to what I was doing before that. Which is good for me to avoid getting distracted by things that aren't important, but it's also bad for me because it's like, you know, I probably be better just doing the thing that came to mind. Like, oh, maybe I should do that, and I just should go do it for a while. But like, high quality time spent on it, I think, is the thing that I would say. Like, high quality time being like things that actually make me feel like I'm getting better at something, which I think is like a really good use of your time.
Yeah,
you're just scratching that itch.
Yeah, and I think my point about mastery is that it is limited in the sense that you can really stretch yourself thin and become a master of multiple things. Like, you could be like Da Vinci or your friend, but there is a limit. You don't have enough hours to be a pool master. And does he play golf super well? Does he play, you know, rugby? So, you know, I can just start naming sports. And then obviously it's like, okay, well, I named like 10 sports. By the 5th sport, you run out of hours in a day to become a master in all of these things.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. But I do think he has like, he does. I feel like, I've heard he's very good at golf, and I've heard he's very like, I at least feel like he's very good at all these things, because he'd beat the pants off of me. But he's not like a pro golfer. I guess he's not pro. He's not pro in any of these games. But he's probably good enough that he feels like he's good enough at those things that he could beat like anyone off the street that just walked in and played pool. Even if they're like, oh, I grew up playing pool with my dad, which is like me. Like, he still beat, you know, the pants off of me and everything.
Yeah. No,
I think go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I do think that people can be better at attaining certain types of mastery. And so then it doesn't take them the 10,000 hours to be a pro. It takes them 1 or whatever it is. Like, they come to that level of excellence much faster than other people. Like you said, it can also just be by the method that they do it, like immersing themselves in it, versus like, oh yes, I practice pool for an hour every day, but then, you know, it wasn't like their heart was in it. They didn't read anything. They didn't do any of the extra work that people that really want to attain mastery do.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different view from you, because I think it sounds like you're like, oh, well, if somebody that's like the best, you know, saxophone player in the world is the person that like every morning picked up saxophone, played it 20 hours a day, and then slept, and that's all they did, and then they didn't focus on anything else. But it's kind of frustrating in the fact that like, and I've experienced this in like Smash and video, like professional gaming, what you'll have is like a 16-year-old will pick up a game and in 6 months be better than anybody in the world at it. Like, they'll be like the best, and you'll be like, we've got to wait 2 years for this guy to be able to actually play professionally, and when he does, he'll be amazing. And then it turns out 2 years later, just immediately like wins, just immediately beats everybody who like objectively has put more hours into the game than he has. Like, there's definitely, because I know it's interesting being in what I would say, like, I've learned from being in a space like this, like a gaming, like competitive gaming, and like putting a ton of times in the games, is that I think I've found examples of like the person who trains obsessively on fundamentals and like fully focuses on the game and does that with their every living breath. And then I've run into people that put absolutely no time into it at all and are just amazing for no reason. Like and
well,
everyone,
it's not no reason,
and
right?
everyone in between. Well, yeah, I mean, no logical reason. Like they just see the game a different way than everybody else does somehow.
Yeah, I think there's many paths to not even necessarily mastery, because mastery maybe connotes like some number of hours, like a black belt, right? Like, you're like, oh, well, you had to rank up on all the belts. Maybe just to the same level of performance. You don't necessarily come by it the same way. I guess this is where I say that there's really two key pieces, and both of them are pretty complicated. There's talent, which is like what you're born with, some innate, you know, how your brain, how your body works, pieces that you don't have that much control over. You might have some in the sense of like your diet or your psychology and your mental health. And then there's your experience, like how you become good at those things. And that's also not just, oh, it's, you know, I put in 5,000 hours and he put in 4,000, so I beat him. It's like, well, I put in 5,000, I was kind of winging it hours, and he put in 4,000 solid hours. Or for him, 4,000 hours was like 8,000 because he got so much more out of it. That's where I think it, like you're talking about, you don't necessarily come to the same level of output in the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that it's what the way I've kind of thought about it is that like there's like this comes back to motivation, because I brought up this earlier. It's like the university analogy where like you'd be kind of foolish, and I don't know who this quote comes for, and I'm not quoting it at all. It's probably Professor X or something that said this.
It's totally X-Men, yeah.
Yeah, it's totally an X-Men quote.
Moving mountains.
You know, you'd be foolish to come up to the library at Oxford and ask, "Is this Oxford?" Or like, and you go down to the student admissions and you're like, "Is this building Oxford?" And then it's like, no, none of them are Oxford. All of them are Oxford. This, like, it's the campus itself that's Oxford, not the individual buildings. And I think that when it comes to mastery, like I've been trying to break down personally for my own benefit, like the different steps to mastery. And that like I've kind of felt like there's this, you know, one aspect of mastery I would think is like mind body connection. You know, it's that idea that like I don't have to think it, like they call it like lowering your mental stack, right? Like there is the idea of playing a chord on, like a G chord on guitar, and it's like, well, I put my middle finger on the third string, my pointer finger on the second fret on the, you know, A string, and then I put my ring finger on the third fret of the E, like the high E string, and then I strum all six, you know, all six strings. And there's that entire mental stack you go through of like place finger on, place that finger, place this, look at that, I'm making sure that I'm holding my pick in the right place, and you're holding a guitar pick and you're strumming, but you're hitting all six strings, and don't accidentally cover any of the strings. Like you're thinking about all that stuff every time you play the chord. And it's like playing the guitar at some point is a matter of lowering that mental stack, so that to the point where you just think G chord and just brown, and you just
your hand hits the shape, your right arm strums. Yeah, it's totally.
But then there's like
mental stack. I think of it from driving school too. The same thing. You have to focus so much. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you can respond. I was talking for a while too. The other thing is like, there's other thing. There is more, but like that's one thing is like that brain body lowering mental stack. So like you take a theoretical concept and you reduce it down to just a singular concept that you know how to just do, and then there's that's like brain body connection, mental stack stuff, and then there's the theoretical knowledge itself. Like I can't think of other examples by this than Smash Brothers, sorry, but like I just know how many frames it takes for Game & Watch to use his up B out of shield, and I know how many frames it takes before I can act out of landing a neutral air with Marth. And I just know that like that they're like, you know, he can't hit me with that move if I land this one properly, because the numbers, like this number's bigger than that number. Like, and that is just like that is not like really a mental stack thing. Like, I just know that, I guess there is a portion of reducing that mental stack, but there is also just the acquisition of that knowledge. That's just like, I just need to know all the frame data for everything. And I've just learned it over time, because every time I hit somebody, thought there was no time for them to do something, and then there was, I went and looked up the frame data and was like, oh, I was wrong. And like the continuous learning through just acquisition of like a big pile of concrete facts, like that's another part of learning. And so I would say, like, I guess what I'm trying to get to is that like what I look at learning is like, I feel like you have to lay the groundwork of like, what are those different things that like I want to do? Like, okay, I have this like mind body thing. I have a list of things I need to become more intuitive with, and I'm less thinky about, so that they just happen and I don't have to think about them. And then I need to build up a pile of like a backlog of stuff to make, you know, automatic. And I would say like, it's very difficult to like, if you were just to sit around, as the example Paul gave, like this is what I say about Paul that kind of was inspiring to me, is he said he was playing golf with his roommates, but then, you know, they saw him coming home every day and just chipping balls into the couch to practice his like, you know, his, I don't know, I don't play golf.
Chipping, but
but then they had to stop wanting to play with him because he's like, this guy's too sweaty. He like takes us way too seriously. We're not gonna
too sweaty.
Yeah, and so there's like that part where it's just like coming home and just doing that. But I also think that's like knowing that he needed to practice that skill is like what makes him good at stuff. Like he knows exactly the next thing he should be doing, and he doesn't spend a lot of time wasted planning. He just gets home and just gets at it and starts practicing.
Good practice habits, definitely.
Yeah.
I also wonder, I mean, you could even ask him, but from what I read, it's a good book. The book's name is Drive, so I probably could have even led with it.
It's relevant for the topic, yeah.
Because it's about, like, he comes up with these motivation architectures in the book. There's like motivation 1.0, motivation 2.0, and those motivation architectures are basically all profit based. So like, why do you do something? It's like, well, you get paid. You get some sort of physical reward, and then as a person, right, you're either greedy, that maps to that, or, you know, you have needs, biological essentialism, blah blah. The third is like motivation 3.0, the mastery concept. He says like the real reason that it really like matters is because you as a person, you decide like, well, what do you want to do with your time? What type of state do you want to be in as a person? Like, do you want to be, like you talk about, constantly living in fear? Do you want to be constantly anxious? Or he says, if you are a master of something, if you're executing something with mastery, then you enter flow states super frequently or almost all the time while you're doing it. So I would wonder with Paul, when he plays pool, is he in flow state? He's just like, boop, and he probably knocks like 2 or 3 balls in a row, and he's not even, the whole world is gone to him. He's just like,
yeah,
in a different place. Sorry.
What do you like about, and it's just a quick time check. We're over an hour now and I'm gonna wrap up soon, but I want to, I have an idea. Maybe we can unpack this more next time, but it's, what's your thought on like the fundamental motivation is to shift your state from where you are to somewhere else,
like an altered state, or
the most vague way possible. Like I'm trying to be so vague so that it definitely applies, and then we can maybe cut away the vagueness to get something that actually applies. But like all motivation is to just move from one state to another,
to like a higher state, or
all of motivation is like an arrow pointing from where you are to where the motivation is pointing to.
Yeah,
and like motivation is just like move from where I am to somewhere else.
Yeah,
because I think that does like change the will to power a little bit, because I think will to power doesn't quite always keep it on top of like, because will to power could say I've acquired all the power, that's it. But you probably would still be motivated even after you were all powerful and had everything. You'd probably still have motivations, and it would be to shift from where you were to somewhere else.
Yes. So I just online etymology dictionary, motivate from motive and eight. So just motive, late 14th century, something brought forward a proposition, assertion, or argument that literally moving, from medieval Latin motivus. So like you talked about, the etymology of the word is about movement. It's not about staying where you are.
Right.
Some sort of change, hopefully positive. I think that's what most motivation is. Or from your perspective, positive, like, oh, I'm motivated to go kill that person. Maybe not positive for them, but yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, but I wonder if the motivation, like in that case, you could boil it down a little bit to say like motivation is a desire to change your emotional state to a different one. Like I don't like the way I feel right now, so therefore I want to do something that doesn't make me feel this way.
Yeah,
and that's like all motivation is like to change emotional states. You could add it on that little,
right? And I would talk about
seasoning on top.
Yeah, a little sprinkle. If you like you talked about Leonardo da Vinci and you talked about Paul, I would guess part of why they're good at more than one thing is that they are good at putting themselves in flow states, or some state of higher performance in terms of learning, in terms of doing. And I think that's what we're all trying to get to. We're not all trying to be half-assed versions of ourselves, or, that's why I do think there's some crappy motivations like, oh, I just want to be in power. But it's like, is that a flow state? Like, do you individually feel better when you're in control of people? I think they're really two separate things.
I actually really starting to like the motivation of like change emotional state, because that's something like, I want to be in power. It's like, do you want to be in power, or do you not want to feel powerless?
Right.
I think that's the motivation.
More accurate.
Right? Yeah.
Motivation.
Interesting. Okay, I feel like we came down to something. We really got somewhere with this.
So bees, that's why we do things. We didn't talk about religion. Well, I guess that's a bad reason to do. We talked about it a little bit, I think, afterlife and stuff. So
I wonder, yeah, we can wrap up here, but the kind of idea that people are motivated to change their emotional state from an unfavorable one to a favorable one.
Definitely.
I think and that's like I think the fundamental motive. That's the fundamental driver to everything. It's just like changing the emotional state that you're in. I think I think that's I even think you could just say from an unfavorable one. I don't think you have to even say to favorable one. So a lot of times people just do anything but the one I'm in right now.
Yeah, they would go from something bad to less bad. Maybe
that's actually some of the reasons why people will like make things worse. Like they'll actively make things worse around them, because they're just like, yeah, I'm just gonna like, I'm now motivated to make things worse because I want change. I hate this place so much, I'll make it worse just so I can be different.
I also see it as boredom, which is like the ultimate, like very ambiguous motivator. Like with the 2-year-old, she's bored. She goes over to her toy shelf, just throws everything off of it, right? Now she's not bored. Now there's a whole bunch of chaos around and she'll get attention because but things were obviously made worse in that moment as far as tripping hazards and things like that go. Yeah. You don't have to go necessarily to a better state. You just have to go to a different state. Maybe addicts are a great example too, right? Like eventually, if you use a drug so much, you don't really go to a better state. You just escape the really bad state of withdrawal. Your motivation becomes maintaining whatever drug-induced state you're in that's kind of lost its positive quality.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I think we can wrap up here. We get some stuff to talk about next time. We can continue. Oh. I think we now have this idea. We can try to refine it a little bit more, or throw it out if it doesn't make sense. I think that ultimately, like, this is super broad and vague and maybe not helpful. Well, I think it's helpful. I think it is. I think it's helped separate the wheat from chaff in certain ways, because I think if you take this and you come back to things like will to power, like we did, I think it actually does help you point away of like, maybe that's not a valid motivation or whatever. Yeah. That's not actually what people are motivated by. Cool. Well, it's been a blast talking to you, and
I feel very motivated.
I'm so motivated to keep having this discussion. I don't want to change my emotional state. I want this to last forever. Just counterpoint the.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, thanks everybody.
Bye.